Hi, welcome to US History, but Interesting, the series where we go through American history connecting with the past by Alan Brinkley chapter by chapter and talk about what the textbook says, what it doesn't say, and why you should care about this history right now in the 21st century. Today, we're covering Chapter 9, Jacksonian America. Let's get into it. Last episode, we left off with Andrew Jackson getting elected president in 1828. In this episode, I want to start by taking a step back and talking about some broad trends that were happening in the American political system. This period is often called the era of the common man, because democracy was expanding and providing a voice to middle and lower class men who had been excluded from most of American politics up to this point. As the country spread westward, new states started allowing all adult white men to vote, and the states on the East Coast eventually followed suit, dropping their long-standing property requirements that essentially limited the vote to the wealthy. At the same time, states allowed voters to choose more members of the state governments rather than just having them be appointed. And finally, national politics also became more democratic. In 1800, the people themselves only voted for presidential electors in 6 states. In the other 10, the state legislatures were the ones who picked the electors. By 1828, the people got to choose their electors in every single state except South Carolina. And to give you a sense of voter participation, between 1824 and 1840, the percentage of adult white men who voted in the presidential election nearly tripled from just under 27% to almost 80%. Having said all of that, we should note that when people thought of the common man in the 1830s, they were talking specifically about white men. If you were female or black or Native American, which at this point was something like 60% of the country, these changes didn't really apply to you. This period also saw some big changes to how political parties worked. You see, in the early days of the United States, political parties were basically just a handful of people in Washington and various state capitals working together to pursue their own goals. These parties didn't really involve common people because they didn't have to. Common people couldn't vote. This led to the general sense that political parties were really just conspiracies by a few wealthy elites to use the rest of the country to keep themselves and their friends in power. When George Washington warned against forming parties in his farewell address, this was the image that he had in mind. But by the 1830s, things were changing. Since the common man could vote now, politicians had to actively campaign in order to get the common man to vote for them. Similarly, the process of choosing a presidential nominee also became more open. In the olden days, the party members in Congress would just pick whoever they liked to run for president, but now parties started holding nominating conventions where more people could participate. With all of those changes, you can kind of see why people began to feel more favorably towards political parties as a concept during this period. Parties seem way less like conspiracies by Washington insiders when they have to actually work to get your vote and let you actually participate in choosing the party leadership. Having said all of that, it's worth going into some detail about the parties that actually existed at this point. On the one hand, you had the Democrats, who coalesced around Andrew Jackson. They broadly believed in limited federal government, free trade, and agricultural expansion. 2 of their biggest priorities were removing perceived aristocratic privileges so that any competent person could rise the social and political ranks, as long as he was a white man, and destroying the Second Bank of the United States. On the other side, it took a while for something coherent to form. The National Republicans who had supported Adams and Clay last chapter eventually merged with the smaller anti-Masonic party to form the Whigs, who were mostly unified by their hatred of Andrew Jackson. Broadly, they wanted to use the federal government to support industrial and commercial development by doing things like funding internal improvements, protecting the national bank, and maintaining protective tariffs. And if that sounds like the American system to you, yeah, you're right. The Whigs basically just copy-pasted all of that from Henry Clay. You really kind of get the feeling that Henry Clay was the brains behind the whole operation, which makes it way funnier when you hear all of the nonsense he has to go through later in this chapter. The Whigs also opposed the Democrats' rapid territorial expansion because they feared that it would cause instability in American society. However, your textbook tells us that both parties, quote, were more interested in winning elections than in maintaining philosophical purity. Which, wow, there's no way for me to relate that to modern life, is there? But with that in mind, we should talk a little about the types of people who generally voted for each party. Democrat voters were mostly working men in the North, Southern planters, Westerners, and Irish and German Catholics. On the Whig side, you had Northern merchants, the relatively few Southerners and Westerners who wanted to make their money through industry and commerce rather than agriculture, and evangelical Protestants. And with that, we can move on to Andrew Jackson's actual presidency. starting with a few smaller things and then moving on to the three major events that happened while Jackson was in office. Jackson's first order of business was to root out corruption within the federal bureaucracy. You see, Jackson had this theory that any man who held power long enough would eventually become corrupt, or, at the very least, lose sight of the people that he was actually supposed to be serving. Jackson's solution was a principle that he called rotation in office, which essentially meant that he would dismiss bureaucrats he thought had been in office too long and replace them with new people who were more devoted to the public good. Now, in practice, Jackson really only replaced 10 to 20% of the federal bureaucracy, which was similar to what happened the last time there was a major party shift after Thomas Jefferson took office. However, that didn't stop this from becoming a major partisan controversy. For Democrats, rotation in office was great because it meant Jackson was breaking up the perceived aristocracy and opening those jobs up to new people who were more deserving. For Jackson's opponents, on the other hand, this was basically just a way for him to fire anybody who disagreed with him and replace them with Democratic Party members who would do whatever he said. Anti-Jacksonians took to calling this the spoils system. The Democrats had won the election, so they got to enjoy all the money and power that came from holding federal office. Another controversial thing that Jackson did while he was president was make aggressive use of his veto power. For example, Congress passed a bill to fund construction of a road in Kentucky. Jackson vetoed it, his supporters claimed a victory for small government, and his opponents said that he was a tyrant. However, unlike the spoils system, in this case, Jackson actually was doing something unusual. He vetoed more legislation during his presidency than all 6 previous presidents had in the first 40 years of the country. And finally, I want to mention something that I actually didn't know until I was doing the research for this video. Last episode, I made an offhand joke about how we should have changed the way presidential elections work after 1824, but we all sort of forgot. You know who didn't forget, though? Andrew Jackson. He called for a constitutional amendment to completely abolish the Electoral College and just let the people vote for president directly. If no one got a majority, Jackson proposed that we just hold a runoff between the top 2 candidates rather than letting the House pick the president like they did in 1824. He repeated his pitch for this amendment in every single State of the Union address he gave for all 8 years that he was in office. From there, we can move on to the first of the 3 major events that happened during Jackson's presidency, the Nullification Crisis. So last time, John Quincy Adams signed into law the Tariff of 1828, which was so widely hated in the South that they called it the Tariff of Abominations. In response, John C. Calhoun, a South Carolinian who served as vice president under both Adams and Jackson, wrote an essay defending an idea called nullification. His argument was basically this: the federal government drew its power from the Constitution, which was a voluntary agreement between the individual states. That meant that the states had the right to decide whether or not the federal government was actually honoring their agreement. In the case of the tariff, Calhoun believed the law was unconstitutional because it unfairly benefited the North at the expense of the South. He suggested that the states should nullify the law, meaning that they would not enforce it within their own borders. If this sounds familiar to you, it's because this is basically what James Madison and Thomas Jefferson said when they wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions back in Chapter 6. In 1832, Congress passed a new tariff, which was still nowhere near low enough to please South Carolina. Their state legislature met at the end of the year and passed a resolution officially nullifying the tariffs of 1828 and 1832, making both of them unenforceable within the state. Now, Andrew Jackson was generally a strong supporter of states' rights, but his number one priority was always defending the Union. He saw nullification as a direct attack on the ability of the United States to govern itself, and therefore an attack on the Union. To him, nullification was treason. Jackson sent troops to South Carolina and proposed a bill to Congress that would explicitly authorize him to use military force if necessary to collect the tariff. In the meantime, Henry Clay pushed a compromise through Congress, including Jackson's force bill, but also agreeing to lower the tariff gradually over the next 10 years. Realizing that they couldn't realistically fight the entire United States military on their own, South Carolina took this opportunity to revoke their nullification and end the crisis. So, what were the consequences of all of that? First of all, nullification was rebuked as a practical matter, but not really philosophically. The force bill convinced South Carolina that they couldn't nullify this particular law without Jackson coming down there and kicking their teeth in, but it didn't really convince anyone that the states shouldn't have the power to resist the federal government. They just had to wait for a better opportunity. Secondly, the nullification crisis kind of worked as a matter of policy. South Carolina threatened to tear the country apart in hopes of getting Congress to lower the tariff, And ultimately, Congress lowered the tariff. It wasn't as much as they would have gotten if they were allowed to nullify the law, but it was certainly more than they would have gotten if they had just accepted the law in the first place. However, that touches on the third point, which was that no individual state could realistically hope to get an outright win against the federal government by itself. If they were going to do this sort of thing again and win, South Carolina would need to have the rest of the South on their side. Finally, the Nullification Crisis pushed John C. Calhoun over to the anti-Jackson side and allowed a New Yorker named Martin Van Buren to take his place as vice president. Next, let's talk about the second major event of Jackson's presidency, Indian removal. In this series, we've often talked about Native Americans in the context of wars with the United States. That was certainly still going on during this period, the Black Hawk War of 1832, for example, but you may be asking if there were ever any situations where Native American nations were able to peacefully coexist with the US, or perhaps assimilate into white American culture. Well, in the South, there were 5 nations that are sometimes called the 5 civilized tribes. These were the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and Muskogee, also known as the Creek. They were completely separate nations, but they get lumped together because they all sort of adopted major aspects of American culture. They converted to Christianity in large numbers, adopted American gender roles, formed constitutional governments, and they built an agricultural economy that included plantations, complete with enslaved African Americans. Remember that the word civilized here just means that they acted like white Americans. In some cases, that meant replicating parts of 19th century America that we today would not really consider civilized. I'll link to a documentary in the description that talks about the experiences of people who were enslaved by these tribes. Just be aware that the documentary is from the 1990s, so some of its language is not really politically correct by modern standards. Despite all of that, many white Americans still didn't see these tribes as truly civilized. In a pattern that should be familiar to you by now, white Americans wanted the land controlled by these nations so that they could build plantations, speculate on real estate, and in some cases mine gold. However, the way the tribes responded was a little different from what you might expect. When the state of Georgia encroached on Cherokee land, the Cherokee actually sued Georgia and took their case to the Supreme Court. In Worcester v. Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that the law Georgia had passed targeting the Cherokee Nation was unconstitutional. Essentially, John Marshall said that the Native American tribes had the right to govern themselves on their own land. They were still subject to federal law, but the states had no authority over the tribes or their land. Now, on paper, that was a huge win for the tribes because it gave them a legal basis to tell the states to back off. In practice, though, the decision didn't really change anything. There's a story that when Andrew Jackson heard about the results of this case, he said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Unfortunately for the tribes, Jackson's response went well beyond just refusing to enforce the Supreme Court's decision. The timeline and the specifics are a little bit complicated, so I'll link to a video from a channel called Knowing Better that covers this in more depth. The whole video is like 2.5 hours long, but the section about Indian removal is less than 20 minutes, and I think it's worth watching. Jackson got Congress to pass a law called the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which gave him the power to negotiate with Native American nations and exchange their current lands for lands west of the Mississippi. Specifically, he was giving out land in Oklahoma that had been chosen because it was out of the way of white settlement on land that they believed was not fertile enough to actually farm. And although I describe this as negotiating an exchange of land, you should remember that if the tribes didn't make a deal with Jackson, the states were probably just going to take their land anyway, and they would wind up with nothing. While the Cherokee were still fighting all of this in court, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Muskogee made deals. The United States Army moved those nations hundreds of miles to Oklahoma, and then built a string of forts along the border to make sure the whites and Native Americans stayed separate going forward. The Seminole took a different approach. Although some individuals did in fact move to Oklahoma, many resisted, kicking off the Second Seminole War, which would drag on into the 1840s. It eventually allowed the few remaining Seminoles who weren't killed or forcibly removed to stay in Florida. That leaves us with the Cherokee. The majority of the Cherokee never agreed to relocate westward. However, there was a minority within the tribe that wanted to negotiate the best terms possible before the United States decided that it was done talking. In 1835, the leaders of this group negotiated the Treaty of New Echota, which agreed to move the entire tribe to Oklahoma. To be clear, this treaty was never ratified by the Cherokee government, nor was it negotiated by their official representatives. But it was a treaty, and that was good enough for Jackson. To emphasize how crazy this is, imagine if I showed up at your house and told you that I had bought it from the government, and when you ask to see my proof, I show you a treaty that I negotiated with the cast of Guardians of the Galaxy. You explain very calmly to me that literally none of those people are even in the government, to which I respond, no, Chris Pratt told me that he was Congress, and I don't think he would lie about that sort of thing, so get out. In the final months of Jackson's presidency, the Senate ratified this treaty and paved the way for Cherokee removal, which would happen under Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren. In the winter of 1838, the government began what's called the Trail of Tears, the process of moving about 16,000 Cherokee roughly 1,000 miles west under absolutely horrible conditions. Most of the Cherokee traveled on foot, and many didn't have sufficient clothing or food. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion were rampant. We don't know exactly how many people died, but the textbook says thousands, perhaps an eighth or more. The AMSCO book says that the number is 4,000, roughly 1 out of every 4 people. And that's just for the Cherokee. The conditions, unfortunately, were similar for the other tribes. Now, it would be very easy to chalk all of that up to racism and just move on. And you wouldn't really be wrong if you said that. But I think it's worth going a bit deeper here, because, you see, Andrew Jackson didn't just do this because he hated Native Americans and wanted them to suffer. Based on his own statements, he believed that this was actually the more humane option, because the alternative was having Native Americans stay in the South and letting white Americans exterminate them through war. He didn't even see peaceful coexistence or assimilation as options. I want to take a second to explore the political philosophy that allowed people like Jackson to convince themselves that that was the case. Previously, I used the textbook's definition of nationalism, which was essentially just giving power or focus to the United States as a singular country. But I also mentioned that there was a more modern definition of nationalism that I would get into later. To understand this more modern definition, we have to start by understanding what philosophers mean when they talk about a nation. In this context, a nation is just a group of people who share some set of traits and customs that let them identify who is part of the nation and who isn't. Those traits could include race, language, religion, or any other number of things. As a concrete example, a common 19th century definition of the American nation, or what I'm going to call real Americans in heavy quotes, would be white, English-speaking Protestants who were born within the territory of the United States. So if that's a nation, then what is nationalism? The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, quote, "Classical nationalism is the political program that sees the creation and maintenance of a fully sovereign state owned by a given ethno-national group, people or nation, as a primary duty of each member of the group." Put more simply, nationalism says that real Americans have a duty to make sure that the United States continues to be owned by and run for the benefit of real Americans. But here's the question. The United States in the early 1800s was home to millions of people who didn't fit this definition of real Americans. How was the government supposed to treat those people? In a nationalist worldview, the answer is that the government can treat them however it wants, as long as it benefits real Americans in the end. Now that's an extreme statement, and it's going to require some extreme evidence to back it up. So I'm going to read you 3 quotes that I think display this philosophy in action. The first is from Andrew Jackson while he was a general under President Monroe. "I have long viewed treaties with the Indians as an absurdity, not to be reconciled to the principles of our government. I have always thought that Congress had as much right to regulate by acts of legislation all Indian concerns as they had of territories. There is only this difference, that the inhabitants of territories are citizens of the United States and entitled to the rights thereof. The Indians are subjects and entitled to their protection and fostering care. The proper guardian of this protection and fostering care is the legislature of the Union. I would therefore contend that the legislature of the Union have the right to prescribe their bounds at pleasure and provide for their wants. And whenever the safety, interest, or defense of the country should render it necessary for the government of the United States to occupy and possess any part of the territory used by them for hunting, that they have the right to take it and dispose of it." In other words, Native Americans are not citizens, so they're not guaranteed the same rights as real Americans. If Congress decides at any point that they want land that is currently occupied by Native Americans, Congress can just take it. End of story. This second quote is from a Supreme Court decision in 1857. The man who wrote this decision was Andrew Jackson's pick to replace John Marshall as Chief Justice. Black people are not included, and were not intended to be included, under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States. The public history of every European nation displays it in a manner too plain to be mistaken. They had, for more than a century before, been regarded as beings of an inferior order, and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. In other words, black people, even free black people, weren't allowed to be citizens. The Constitution gave them no guarantee of rights, and slavery was not just legal, it was completely justified. And at this point, it might seem like nationalism is really just racism with extra syllables, but I want to share one more quote that has to do with the treatment of white abolitionists who tried to send anti-slavery literature to the South. This is from Jackson's State of the Union address in 1835. In connection with these provisions in relation to the Post Office Department, I must also invite your attention to the painful excitement produced in the South by attempts to circulate through the mails inflammatory appeals addressed to the passions of the slaves, in prints and in various sorts of publications, calculated to stimulate them to insurrection and to produce all the horrors of a servile war. He goes on to describe anti-slavery activism in the South as unconstitutional and wicked, and he concludes as follows. I would therefore call the special attention of Congress to the subject, and respectfully suggest the propriety of passing such a law as will prohibit under severe penalties the circulation in the Southern states through the mail of incendiary publications intended to instigate the slaves to insurrection. In other words, anyone who so much as mails someone an anti-slavery newspaper is actively trying to start a slave rebellion, and the federal government should punish them for it severely. Now, obviously, this was designed to protect the institution of slavery and continue stripping black people of their human rights, but this policy also stripped white people of their right to share certain ideas with certain other white people. The point is that nationalism isn't just a system where white people have rights and people of color have none. It's a system that actively pursues policies to exploit and marginalize anyone who opposes the hierarchy that puts real Americans on the top and everyone else on the bottom. With that, let's move on to the third and final major event of Jackson's presidency, the climactically named Bank War. The charter for the Second Bank of the United States was up for renewal in 1836, and if you've been paying attention, you can probably guess that people had some opinions about this. Supporters of the bank saw it as a stabilizing force in the American economy. It had branches in 30 different cities, and it issued banknotes that could be used as currency throughout the country. It also held all of the deposits for the federal government. This meant that it was large enough and had enough national influence that it could effectively restrain local banks from engaging in the kind of recklessness that pro-bank advocates believed had caused the Panic of 1819 last chapter. On the flip side, you had so-called soft money people. They agreed that the national bank was restraining local banks, but they actually saw that as a bad thing. Local banks needed the freedom to provide credit to businesses and stimulate the economy. And if it just so happened that the local bank owners wound up making way more money in this situation, well, that was just a happy coincidence that had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that many of the soft money people were themselves local bankers. Finally, you had the hard money crowd. To them, real money was things like gold and silver, things that you could see and touch. All this credit and speculation was just a way for rich Eastern aristocrats to exploit everyday Americans. To them, the Second Bank of the United States represented a system that had caused financial instability in the West for decades, eventually culminating in the Panic of 1819. Jackson was firmly in the hard money camp. This scared the bank's leadership enough that they started a PR campaign led by Bank President Nicholas Biddle to shift public opinion in favor of the bank. Biddle also built relationships with anti-Jackson politicians like Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts and eventually Henry Clay. Clay convinced Biddle to apply to have the bank's charter renewed early. Here was his reasoning. Clay believed he could get the charter through Congress. That would send the bill to Andrew Jackson's desk, and at that point, Jackson could do one of two things. Either he could sign the bill into law, at which point the bank would continue and Clay and Biddle would win, or he could veto the bill, at which point the entire country would know that Jackson was the one person standing in the way of the continuation of the bank. This would put him in the difficult position of having to defend that decision throughout the entire presidential election of 1832, in which Henry Clay was his main opponent. In the end, Congress passed the bill, Jackson vetoed it, Clay campaigned on the bank issue, and then Jackson won the election 219-49. With this landslide victory and the successful resolution of the Nullification Crisis, which, remember, was happening at the same time as all of this, Jackson turned back to his enemies at the bank. He determined that he was not just going to wait until 1836 and let the charter expire. Instead, he was going to kill the bank now. Because the bank derived so much power from the fact that it held the federal government's investments, Jackson decided to move the money elsewhere. Jackson's Secretary of the Treasury actually thought this was such a bad idea that he refused to do it. Jackson replaced him, and when the second guy also refused to move the money, Jackson replaced him too. The third Treasury Secretary was Roger B. Taney, the guy who would eventually write that Supreme Court decision about how black people can't be citizens. Taney followed Jackson's instructions, moving all of the federal government's deposits to state banks. Jackson's opponents took to calling these institutions Jackson's pet banks. They believed that he was just giving money to bank presidents who supported him politically, rather than putting the money in the places that made the most sense financially. Over at the Bank of the United States, Nicholas Biddle announced that he had to take drastic action to keep the bank afloat after Jackson's removal of deposits. His hope was that by calling in loans and raising interest rates, he could cause a minor economic downturn, but convince everyone that it was Jackson's fault for putting him in the corner. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. Jackson remained popular, as did his financial policy. Biddle lost the battle for public opinion, and in the end, the charter expired in 1836 without any serious hope for renewal. With the bank dead, Jackson had one more hard money policy to implement. You see, by the end of 1836, land speculation had once again reached a fever pitch. That was in part because land speculation is just what Americans do when the economy is good, but it was also spurred on by the fact that Jackson's Indian removal policy had put tens of millions of acres of formerly tribal land up for sale in just a few years. In response, Jackson issued something called the Specie Circular, which said that the government would only accept payment for land in gold or silver. No more paper money from random state banks. Jackson hoped that this would curb speculation and the inflation it was causing, but the full economic impact of this order wouldn't be obvious until after he left office. Jackson's vice president, Martin Van Buren, easily won the election of 1836. When he took office, he carried out the end of Jackson's Indian removal policy, including the Trail of Tears. However, the rest of Van Buren's presidency was defined by the economy, and that was not a good thing for him. The Panic of 1837 was the worst economic depression in American history up to this point. The Specie Circular had made it harder to speculate on land, which caused land prices to crash. At the same time, people started asking banks to exchange their paper money for gold, which the banks just didn't have, so the banks started to fail. Poor wheat yields caused food prices to rise, and economic trouble in Europe caused foreign investment in the US to dry up. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. And this was at a time when the federal government had just given up its ability to potentially stabilize the economy through the Bank of the United States. Through all of this, Van Buren followed Jackson's lead. He refused to recharter the bank, or to do much of anything, to be honest. The economy continued to suffer. Going into the presidential election of 1840, the Whigs had a plan. They nominated William Henry Harrison, whom you may remember as the guy who fought against Tecumseh back in Chapter 7. In terms of policies, it really didn't matter. Harrison was going to win because people hated Van Buren, and then Henry Clay was going to lead the party from his position in the Senate, and they were finally going to get to implement all of that stuff that I said at the beginning of this chapter. This was a foolproof plan. There was no way that it could possibly backfire and make the Whigs look like complete idiots on a scale so large that people would still be making fun of them 180 years later. William Henry Harrison died 31 days after his inauguration in 1841. The only interesting part of his presidency was the question of what exactly happens when a president dies in office. Vice President John Tyler took it upon himself to answer this question by having someone swear him in as president. Now, John Tyler was not supposed to be president. So much so that he earned the nickname His Accidency. Beyond the obvious, he wasn't even really a Whig. He was a Democrat who would just switch sides because of Jackson's handling of the Nullification Crisis. While Tyler was president, he vetoed several major Whig policies and refused to support the creation of a new national bank. He became the first president to have his veto overridden by Congress, and after less than a year of this, all but one of his cabinet members resigned in protest. By the end of his presidency, Tyler essentially returned to the Democratic side of the aisle, along with politicians like John C. Calhoun, who had only really left in the first place because they had a problem with Jackson. In spite of all that, the Tyler administration actually did accomplish some things. Daniel Webster, the original Whig Secretary of State, negotiated a treaty with the British called the Webster-Ashburton Treaty that formally established the border between Canada and the state of Maine. Secondly, during his time in office, the United States established formal diplomatic relations with China through the Treaty of Wanghia. If you're curious about the general flavor of this treaty, I'll just point out that its Wikipedia page has a See Also section that includes articles titled Western Imperialism in Asia and Unequal Treaty. If you're really curious, you should also Google the phrase First Opium War, which is a fascinating story in its own right, but is unfortunately outside the scope of this course. For today, though, let's close with a discussion of why this history matters in the 21st century. And before we start, I should note that this section is going to discuss sexual assault. So if you're not in the right headspace for that at the moment, feel free to click off of this video now, and I'll see you next time. In this chapter, John Marshall and the Supreme Court ruled that Native American tribal governments were subject to federal authority, but not state authority. Andrew Jackson refused to enforce this, so in reality, the tribes were actually subject to both federal and state authority. This whole issue about how much tribes are allowed to govern themselves versus how much they have to do what various levels of US government tell them is called tribal sovereignty, and it has continued to be a major point of contention for the 2 centuries between this chapter and the modern day. We're going to get into some of those disputes in more detail later in this course, but for now, I want to talk about one way that our current policies around tribal sovereignty affect Native women in particular. Sexual violence is a serious issue in the United States in general. More than 1 out of every 6 women in the United States will experience completed or attempted rape at some point during her lifetime. For Native American women, the rate is about twice as high, just over 1 in 3. And there are reasons to think that the real number is even higher than that. Muskogee lawyer and activist Sarah Deer describes the situation as follows. Through my work in Native communities, I've heard more than once, I don't know any woman in my community who has not been raped. But what does that have to do with tribal sovereignty? Well, part of the answer is that the US government has hamstrung the ability of local tribal governments to enforce rape laws on tribal lands in a couple of different ways. The first is by creating such a confusing web of overlapping jurisdiction that it's not always even clear whose job it is to enforce the law. Sometimes cases bounce around between tribal, state, and federal law enforcement, and sometimes they slip through the cracks and just never get addressed. Secondly, the federal government limited the maximum sentence that tribal governments could give for criminal offenses. Until 2010, if you were raped on an Indian reservation, the maximum penalty the tribe could give your attacker was 1 year in prison. After 2010, that cap went up to 3 years, but only if the tribe met certain criteria. Compare that to the federal government, which could always put the attacker in prison for life. Third, in 1978, the Supreme Court ruled that tribal governments didn't actually have the authority to try non-natives for criminal offenses at all. Meaning that even if you were a tribal member and the rape happened on tribal land, if your attacker was non-native, the maximum criminal penalty that the tribal government could hand out wasn't 1 year in prison, it was literally nothing. And this is especially disgusting when you realize that almost 90% of Native victims of rape or sexual assault reported having an attacker who was either white or black rather than Native American. So yeah, tribal sovereignty may not be as central to the national political conversation now as it was during Andrew Jackson's time, but policies like this are actively preventing tribal governments from protecting their people, and specifically their women and Two-Spirit people, at this very moment. I will say, though, that there are a ton of Native women-led organizations that are actively working to fix this. If you're interested in learning more and figuring out how to support them in this work, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center has an entire page with resources for non-Native allies to learn more about sexual violence and other issues confronting Native American people today. I'll link to them down below, and I'll also link to a YouTube channel called Native Lady Book Warrior that has a reading list of indigenous nonfiction books that you can check out to learn even more. Both of those lists actually include the book that I based this section off of, which is called The Beginning and End of Rape by Sarah Deer. And Deer is actually a good note to end on because she's a Muskogee woman who was instrumental in advocating for the 2013 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. That law addressed some of the issues I talked about by allowing tribal governments to prosecute non-natives for rape in certain cases. And that's the note that I want to end on because that law is far from perfect. Deer herself makes that point in her book. But it is a first step, and it shows that progress can happen. We just have to realize that there's a long way to go, and we're going to have to keep fighting to get there. So yeah, that's it for episode 9. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, drop a like, comment, subscribe for future episodes. Otherwise, I'll see you next time for Chapter 10, America's Economic Revolution, in which we take a break from some of these darker aspects of American history, and we get to talk about choo-choo trains.